Ancient Roman history is littered with dramatic events and epic battles, and the Gallic Wars fought by Julius Caesar are an outstanding example of that. It not only shows the strategic skills of the Roman army, but also molded the future of Europe for centuries, largely due to the actions of Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar had become Roman consul in 59 BC, the highest position in the Roman Republic, but his hectic political activities had left him in debt, and he had amassed several enemies in Rome. To ensure his position and fend off his political opponents, Caesar required immediate financial resources and impressive military victories. When the moment came to allocate the provinces that would be governed by Caesar as proconsul, he cleverly used his political allies to secure control over Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and Transalpine Gaul, obtaining an unprecedented 5-year period of rule in these regions. Julius Caesar was put in command of 4 seasoned legions. All of them had fought alongside Caesar in earlier campaigns, forging a deep bond of loyalty between the soldiers and their leader. Having more than 20,000 legionnaires in total, as well as auxiliaries, Caesar now wielded the military power necessary for his ambitions. Yet he still needed to come up with a convincing justification for waging war. The Helvetians, a Celtic tribe, were about to undertake a monumental endeavor in 58 BC, a migration towards Gaul. This was just what Caesar needed to launch a war and improve his reputation in Rome. Headed by Orgetorix, the Helvetians had formed a confederation with some neighboring tribes, building up an astounding force that included 368,000 people, including men, women, and children. Orgetorix's plan was far-reaching and entailed drastic measures to ensure the successful migration. One such notable step was his decision to burn down their own homes. This extreme move had a clear purpose: to prevent any possibility of return. By torching their dwellings, the Helvetians were committing themselves to the journey towards Gaul, without the option of turning back. A significant turning point occurred, however, when Orgetorix, charged with tyranny, was forced to take his own life. This reversal brought Divico into the spotlight. Driven to keep the migration plan, Divico focused on accumulating the resources needed to advance into Gaul. Nevertheless, a difficult choice awaited the Helvetian leader. There were 2 main options open to him: to cross the lands of the Roman allies known as Aedui in the province of Transalpine Gaul, or to follow the longer route across the openings between the northern mountains. The Romans kept the dangerous threat of migrating tribes in mind. The turmoil caused by the Germanic tribes of the Scythians and Teutons, who had migrated into Roman territory, ended in the Cimbrian War between 113 and 101 BC. Remembering previous conflicts made the Romans quite uneasy about the tribes on the move, increasing Julius Caesar's readiness to respond to the call for help from the Aedui. Caesar gathered one of his regional legions and set off towards Geneva, where he made the strategic decision to demolish the bridge over the River Rhone, the main access route to Transalpine Gaul. The Helvetians, sensing the urgency of the situation, pleaded with Caesar for military permission to pass through Roman lands, while at the same time promising not to attack. Caesar, mindful of the need to gain time, feigned pondering the proposal for almost a fortnight. Whilst Caesar seemed to be considering the Helvetians' proposal, his legion displayed remarkable ingenuity and strategic skills. Over this period, they managed to build an imposing fortified embankment that stretched for more than 30 kilometers along the river. This stunning structure not only shielded the legion, but also blocked the passage of the Helvetians completely. When they ignored Caesar's orders and attempted to cross the river using small vessels, they were met with fierce opposition from the Roman legionnaires. These resourceful soldiers launched javelins and arrows at the invaders, stopping them in their tracks. Confronted with the southern blockade, the Helvetians took the longer route through the northern mountains to reach Gaul. Caesar made a strategic decision during this period to allow his lieutenant Labienus to be in command of the existing forces, while he himself returned to Italy. Caesar recruited 2 more legions on Italian territory, boosting his contingent to more than 30,000 legionnaires, as well as additional auxiliaries and troops. Labienus failed to effectively obstruct access via the mountainous route, allowing the Helvetians to push on and wreak havoc in the Gallic lands. Against such odds, the Gauls appealed to Julius Caesar to step in and face the invading Helvetians. Yet again, he proved his eagerness to help his Gallic allies by leading his legions even deeper into Gallic territory. Labienus's decision not to obstruct the Helvetians in the mountains was Caesar's direct order, since he was determined to face the invaders and secure Gaul. Caesar was informed that the Helvetians were attempting to cross the river Arar, modern-day River Saône. This journey was being undertaken in 4 large groups, using several rafts and boats. But, given the size of the Helvetian tribe and the poor organization, the crossing had already taken several days, with one of the groups still on its way. Julius Caesar was offered a crucial strategic opportunity to deal with the Helvetians and stop their progress. He arranged his legions in battle formation and threw a surprise attack at the Celts who were just about to cross the river. Caught by surprise and in disarray, the Helvetians had no time to form a proper battle line. The fight ended quickly, with all members of the trapped Helvetius group either killed or retreating into the nearby forest. The other Helvetians were left with nothing to do but witness the defeat of their fellows. The Helvetians' main force started to move, and Julius Caesar, adamant not to lose momentum, took quick action. He ordered a bridge to be built over the river and moved all his legions to the opposite side. Whereas it took the Helvetians 3 weeks to cross the river, the Romans did it in just 1 day. Caesar started chasing them, hoping for the right moment to deliver a decisive attack. Although he had an overwhelming advantage, Caesar had to abandon the battlefield due to poor communication from his scouts. This was a setback to his plans. Furthermore, the legion's supplies were running low. Given this situation, Caesar took the decision to head for the nearby town of Bibracte to resupply his army before pursuing further. While on the march, Diviciacus kept chasing Caesar, damaging the rear guard of the Roman army. To tackle this situation, Caesar dispatched his cavalry and light infantry to engage the enemy, delaying them and saving time to deploy his main force on a nearby hill. The 4 veteran legions formed 3 front lines, whilst the 2 newly recruited legions and auxiliaries were stationed further up the hill. The Helvetians, numbering around 100,000 warriors, successfully drove back the Roman cavalry and light infantry, obliging the legionnaires to retreat. Then, they organized their infantry ranks into a robust shield formation and moved towards the Romans. The Roman strategy of hurling javelins at the Helvetian shields resulted in mayhem in the enemy ranks. The Helvetians had to abandon their shields and break up their formations. With their shield wall in shambles, the Roman legionnaires managed to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was fierce and challenging, but the Romans' discipline and experience started to gradually come to the fore. As the Romans pushed towards the mountain, a group of Helvetian allies entered the battle. Now reinforced, they started to exert pressure on the Romans. Caesar opted to send his veteran line, as the first 2 legionary units were already involved in the mountain battle. As time passed, the Helvetians on the mountain were eventually pushed out of the fight. Their allies, meanwhile, withdrew towards the camp and built a last stand, improvising a defensive wall against the Romans. After a drawn-out battle that raged all night, the legionnaires finally succeeded in entering the enemy camp, putting an end to the fighting. Caesar lost around 5,000 men, while the Helvetians suffered losses estimated at between 40,000 and 60,000 warriors. Following the battle, Caesar granted his men a 3-day rest break after the intense fighting before returning to chase the Helvetians. Upon seeing the Romans approaching again, they decided to surrender altogether and were forced to return to their homeland. Caesar had achieved his objective of a quick military victory and managed to contain his opponents. As Caesar was still engaged in fighting the Helvetians at the Battle of Bibracte, another threat to his rule in Gaul was emerging. This menace was posed by the Suebi, a Germanic group that had recently crossed the River Rhine and was in search of a new home in Gaul. These undaunted warriors looked set to confront the Roman legions, giving Julius Caesar another chance to test his skills as a commander. Ariovistus, leader of the Suebi, entered Gaul with his tribe for the first time in 63 BC, as hired mercenaries in a war against the Aedui, who were Roman allies. The warriors who Ariovistus initially led went on to play a key role in the battle, contributing to a decisive victory at the Battle of Magatobriga. As a response, the Aedui dispatched an emissary to Rome in search of help. At the time, however, the Roman Republic was grappling with the political consequences of Catiline's conspiracy and could not provide the necessary aid. The governor of Transalpine Gaul was given instructions to assist Rome's Gaul allies whenever possible. Also, in 59 BC, the Roman Senate appointed Ariovistus as friend of the Roman people to keep him in check. Ariovistus seized this period to reclaim a third of their land as compensation for having defeated the Aedui. He allowed more of his people to cross the Rhine and settle in these new Gallic lands. By 58 BC, more than 100,000 Suebi had crossed the Rhine and established in Gaul. Ariovistus subsequently increased his territorial demands on the Sequani, who had contracted his services, seeking space to settle more Germanics. He also started to take hostages as a way of pressuring the Sequani and the Aedui to comply with his demands. The situation was getting worse and action had to be taken. While he was in camp at Bibracte, Caesar was paid a visit by a council of Gaul leaders and diplomats, with Diviciacus at their head. While expressing their gratitude to Caesar for his victory, the Gaul leadership asked for his assistance against the Suebi. Although Caesar was willing to help, he encountered a problem. As Ariovistus was regarded as a friend of Rome, he could not engage in war with him straight away. Therefore, Caesar decided to invite Ariovistus to a meeting, but his offer was declined. To solve the situation diplomatically, Caesar sent an emissary to Ariovistus, demanding that he release the Gaul hostages he had captured and cease hostilities with the Aedui. Caesar pointed out to Ariovistus that, if he agreed to these conditions, the Romans would not engage in hostile action against him. Caesar's offer was beneficial to Ariovistus, since, by agreeing to the terms, he would be allowed by Rome to keep the lands he had already conquered from the Sequani without war. Nevertheless, Ariovistus refused again. Meanwhile, the Germans who had crossed the Rhine were authorized to plunder and ravage the Gallic lands as they pleased. Caesar now had solid grounds, since the Senate had handed down a decree authorizing the use of force to protect Rome's Gallic allies. He could make the case that the Suebi posed a threat to Rome's borders, and that Ariovistus had lost his status as friend of Rome by carrying on plundering the lands of Rome's allies. Caesar rallied his legions and headed off to war. Both armies started marching towards Vesontio, the largest Sequani city. This well-fortified and well-supplied town would play a key role in providing their respective forces with resources during the impending conflict. The Romans succeeded in getting there before their opponents, thanks to a relentless march. Caesar used the time in Vesontio to supply his legions and allow his soldiers to rest for a short while. As rumors of the Germans' supposed numerical superiority began to spread among the legionaries, the troops' morale wavered, and some began to doubt whether it was worth engaging in battle. Caesar's decisiveness was key to restoring order among his troops. He stated that, even if no other legion would follow him, he would face Ariovistus with his trusted 10th Legion. These words inspired fanatical allegiance in the 10th Legion, and the fear of being labeled cowards prompted the other legions to gear up and prepare to march against the Suebi. Ariovistus proposed a meeting with Caesar and asked that only a few knights from each side take part in it, which would be held in Vosges, in what is now Alsace. Caesar accepted the proposal, but the meeting did not lead to an agreement, with both generals restating their positions and keeping up the tension between their forces. Ariovistus, conscious of the political situation in Rome, said that many Romans would be grateful if he killed Caesar, putting an end to any chance of negotiation. There were no more negotiation attempts after that statement. A few days later, Ariovistus offered another meeting, but Caesar became suspicious of a setup, so he sent messengers in his place. Ariovistus captured these messengers and contemplated executing them. Instead, he decided to go into battle, leading an army of around 30,000 to 40,000 men, made up of cavalry, light infantry, and heavy infantry. Ariovistus stunned Caesar by deploying his troops behind the Romans and laying down an entrenchment that cut off their supply lines. Caesar tried to instigate a battle for 5 days, but Ariovistus refrained from direct confrontation and focused only on disrupting Roman supplies. The Suebi employed a unique tactic, mixing infantrymen with horsemen to inflict damage on the Romans. In view of this situation, Caesar positioned his legions in 3 lines to prepare for decisive action. Caesar made a strategic move by stationing his 3rd Legion line behind the Suebi, starting to build a second camp. In turn, Ariovistus dispatched his light infantry and cavalry to continue pressuring the Romans, but avoided gathering all his forces for fear of being easily defeated. When Caesar's second camp was concluded, he left 2 legions and part of his auxiliaries to defend it, while the other 4 legions returned to the main camp. Ariovistus's remaining army began to attack Caesar's legions in a ferocious battle. Eventually, the Romans succeeded in repelling the attack and even captured some prisoners. They defended the second camp, and during interrogations with Suebi prisoners, Caesar found out that Ariovistus was taking advice from his priests not to fully assemble his forces until after the new moon. This helped explain his earlier approach. Now knowing that strategy, Caesar made preparations and led his legions in an attack on the Suebi camp, while keeping garrisons in his own. The Suebi replied to the attack, and both sides entered into hand-to-hand combat. It was an all-out battle, with the Romans resorting to swords instead of spears as the enemy attacked too quickly. Both sides built up shield walls, making it an even fight with no clear winner. While the Suebi were in the majority, the Roman cavalry, led by Publius Licinius Crassus, joined the battle to aid the legions. They did so just in time to prevent the defeat of the Roman left wing, and thus the Suebi were finally defeated, with Ariovistus fleeing with his army back to the Rhine. While the exact number of dead is unknown, this marked another triumph for Caesar in his Gaul campaign. He left Labienus in command to spend the winter with the legions while attending to his duties in Cisalpine Gaul. Within 1 year, Julius Caesar successfully dealt with 2 major Roman threats, the Helvetians and the Suebi, consolidating Roman control over Gaul. In 57 BC, the Belgae, an alliance of tribes from northern Gaul, started to assemble a coalition to oppose the Romans, concerned about their seeming takeover of the territory. Led by King Galba of the Suessians, the Belgae got ready to confront Caesar. Labienus reported the forming of this group to Caesar. When the general learned of this threat, he moved quickly, sending 2 more legions to the Belgian border. With these additions, Caesar found himself in command of 8 legions, totaling approximately 44,000 men, including auxiliaries. As the Belgae readied themselves for war, Caesar attempted to gain the approval of the Roman Senate to confront them, as he considered them a similar threat to that posed by the Helvetians and Suebi. The Roman Republic, however, was slowly losing influence over Caesar's actions, and many in Rome suspected that his achievements in Gaul served Caesar's personal interests rather than Roman ones. Caesar took swift action, marching into the Remi territory, a nearby Belgae tribe, where they surrendered and gave him information about the Belgae alliance. Caesar then convinced the Aedui to attack the Belgae lands, opening a second front while he led his legions against the main Belgae army. He crossed the river Axona and pitched a secure camp on a hill, providing rear protection due to the river and marshy terrain ahead, hampering a frontal attack. He also made sure to leave 6 cohorts in a fortified position on the other side of the bridge to cover his supply line. While he waited, the Belgae surrounded the town of Bibrax, belonging to the Remi, about 13 kilometers from their camp. The Remi asked Caesar for help, but he was unwilling to abandon his defensive position, suspicious of a possible trap. He instead sent groups of auxiliary infantry to infiltrate Bibracte and assist the Remi. Galba, the leader of the Belgae, attempted to surprise Caesar, but he held his defensive position. Galba dispatched a sizable force to cross the river and attack the Roman troops protecting the supply line, hoping to compel Caesar to relinquish his fortified position or leave him without supplies. But Caesar marshaled his light infantry and cavalry to engage the Belgae during the crossing, whilst his legions stood in defense. The Roman cavalry reached the crossing in time to block some of the Belgians, and the projectile-launching troops struck the Belgae in the water. This effective strategy frustrated Galba's plans and kept Caesar in his strong position. Following the Belgae failed attempt to cross the river and the setbacks in their campaign, Galba learned that the Aedui were attacking the lands of the Bellovaci. As the Romans surrounded them, Galba withdrew and the Belgae tribes dispersed, having agreed to regroup if the Romans continued to advance. Caesar subtly pursued the Belgae with his cavalry and 3 legions, inflicting significant casualties due to their lack of organization. Many tribes surrendered to the Roman legions, but some, led by the king of the Nervi, Bodunatus, organized themselves to resist Caesar. Bodunatus set up an ambush for Caesar on the banks of the river Sabis, constructing obstacles to prevent the Romans from crossing. Caesar split his army into 2 groups, with the veteran legions leading the way and the younger ones trailing behind. He dispatched his cavalry and light infantry across the shallow river to scout the opposite bank and face the ambush. The Romans were surprised by the Nervi cavalry, which resulted in a brief clash. The Belgae cavalry retreated, luring the Romans back, and then the Nervi attacked in full force. The Roman cavalry and light infantry ran back across the river to the Roman camp, with the Nervi in pursuit. This kicked off the Battle of the River Sabis, in which the Belgae crossed the river quickly, nearly catching the Romans unprepared. The Roman experience and discipline enabled them to quickly form a battle line, but the obstacles set up by the Bodunats in the camp hindered the orderly formation of the Roman legions. During the Battle of the River Sabis, the Roman legions engaged several Belgae tribes separately, with heavy fighting on 3 fronts. Although the Roman left wing managed to push the Atrebates back to the Belgae camp, and the center was pushing forward against the Viramandui, the Roman right wing was in difficulty, surrounded by the Nervi. Caesar took personal charge of the defense of the 12th Legion and kept the soldiers' morale high. Labienus, commander of the 10th and 9th Legions, sent the former to help on the Roman right, turning the tide of the battle in favor of the Romans. The Nervi, faced with Roman reinforcements, were surrounded and fought bravely, but were defeated. Belgae casualties were significant, with only around 500 surviving, whereas the Romans also suffered substantial losses, with up to 5,000 soldiers killed. Caesar once again stood victorious and the Nervi surrendered, cementing Rome's control over a large part of Gaul. The German tribes of Usipetes and Tencteri, pressured by the Suebi, started a westward migration in 58 BC, crossing the Rhine in 55 BC and entering the territory of the Menapi. When the Germans arrived, the Menapi vacated their settlements on the east bank of the Rhine and held the right bank to avoid a German crossing. Lacking boats, the Germans tricked the Menapi by falsely retreating and carried out a night attack, capturing the Gauls' boats and conquering part of the Menapi's territory. Aware of the circumstances, Caesar left Cisalpine Gaul for Transalpine Gaul earlier than usual. Moreover, the Germans were invited by Gaul tribes to serve as mercenaries in intertribal wars, leading them to settle in the territory of the Eburones and the Condrusi, who were Roman clients between the river Musa and the Rhine. Caesar called together Gaul leaders, pledged allegiance to Rome, and requested cavalry. He then went to Koblenz to face the German tribes. They asked for land and offered an alliance, but Caesar declined the proposal and offered land on the other side of the Rhine, in the territory of the Ubii. The German representatives asked for 3 days to consider Caesar's offer, requesting that he not move his camp any closer during this period. He refused due to reports that they had sent a large cavalry force across the river Musa to plunder Ambiorix's lands, suspecting that they were merely delaying the fight until the force returned. Caesar kept on marching, and the German envoys resurfaced, asking him to refrain from advancing and to allow them to send an embassy to the Ubii. The German emissaries asked for 3 more days to negotiate with the Ubii, and agreed to accept Caesar's terms if the Ubii accepted. Although hesitant, Caesar decided to wait and moved another 4 miles in search of water, where he gathered all his troops and planned to make a decision on the German request. He instructed his cavalry not to attack, and to wait for him if they were assaulted. Once the German cavalry charged, despite the unfavorable odds, they managed to defeat the Roman cavalry, slaying 74 of its members, while the rest fled towards Caesar's column. Caesar moved fast after the cavalry battle to avoid the retreat being interpreted as a defeat. He took his army on a surprise march to the German camp, catching them unprepared. The Romans stormed it, and while some resisted briefly, many Germans fled, including women and children. Caesar chased after the escapees, causing the morale of the Germanic tribes to plummet as they abandoned their weapons and ran towards the river in hope of safety. Following the victory over the Germans, many were killed or drowned trying to cross the Rhine. Caesar faced a lot of criticism in Rome, however, especially for having arrested the German emissaries sent to apologize for the cavalry attack. Caesar's political opponents in Rome seized on this to criticize his conduct during the campaign. Caesar nonetheless decided to cross the Rhine. He would become the first Roman general to do so, and could further hush up any criticism of his actions against the Germans, as well as increasing his reputation. He also believed that crossing the river would deter future German incursions. Caesar was intent on pursuing the German cavalry who had allied themselves with the Sicambri after crossing the Musa. He sent messengers to the Sicambri, demanding the return of the German fugitives. The Sicambri rejected Caesar's request, claiming that Roman rule did not extend beyond the left bank of the Rhine, and their actions were beyond Caesar's reach. Caesar's triumph did not impress most of the German tribes, except for the Ubii, who established a treaty of friendship with Rome. They offered boats to help cross the Rhine, but Caesar was wary of the Ubii and rejected the offer due to concerns about the operation's safety. Right then, Roman engineering skills kicked in to surprise the Germans. Instead of using boats, Caesar ordered the construction of a striking bridge, which was finished in just 10 days. It was probably built in the middle of the Rhine, north of Koblenz. This was an impressive feat of engineering, as the Rhine in this region has an average width of around 1,300 feet and a depth of approximately 20 feet. During the building process, Caesar was asked for peace and alliance by multiple Germanic tribes, which he accepted favorably, provided they handed over hostages as a guarantee of their trustworthiness. While a guard stood at the bridge, the Roman forces marched towards the territory of the Sicambri, who had already fled when they heard about the bridge's construction. Like some of the Gaul tribes had done before, the Sicambri sought refuge in the forests, taking with them all their belongings. Caesar spent a few days in the Sicambri's territory, where he destroyed and set fire to several villages. 18 days after completing the bridge, he ordered its destruction. This action not only served as a warning to the German tribes, but also as a signal to his opponents in Rome, showing that Caesar was willing to face any challenge and take whatever decisions he deemed necessary.
Julius Caesar launched a series of campaigns in 58 BC that pushed the Roman boundaries and changed the history of the region. Besides his accomplishments in Gaul, Caesar always sought to reach what no one before him had achieved. During his campaigns in Gaul, he took it upon himself to break through a new frontier, a land unknown and almost legendary to the Romans, many of whom doubted its very existence, the island of Britannia. A mysterious and uncharted land for the Romans, Britannia was an island believed to be teeming with wealth and mythical beings. The idea of seizing this unknown territory was appealing to Caesar, who was always looking for new avenues to increase his reputation and power. He felt that conquering Britannia would not only increase his prestige, but also bring wealth and resources to the Roman Republic. By 55 BC, after crushing the Gaul rebellion the previous year, wiping out a Germanic tribe, and building the first bridge over the Rhine, Caesar decided that the best way to burnish his reputation and bolster his image amongst the Roman people was to cross the canal and venture into this unknown land. His official plea for the whole expedition was that the Bretons were assisting their enemies in Gaul during the recent incursions, but we cannot know for sure how true this assertion was. The build-up to the invasion was painstaking and strategic. Caesar gathered a fleet of around 80 transport ships, enough to carry 2 legions, and a small detachment of warships to protect them. Crossing the English Channel was a staggering feat in itself. Although the Romans were expert in land battles, they were not known for their naval skills. Caesar's determination and the discipline of his legions, however, ensured a successful crossing, notwithstanding the unfamiliar and potential treacherous waters. The arrival in Britannia posed its own challenges. The native Britons, forewarned of the approaching Romans, had gathered on the Dover cliffs, ready to resist the invasion. The sight of the natives on the rocks, together with the difficulty of landing on the steep beach, led Caesar to sail further north in search of a more suitable landing place. The beach battle was ferocious. The Romans, still knee-deep in water and carrying heavy military equipment, had to contend with the Britons attacking them from the shore. The discipline and courage of the Roman legionaries prevailed, and they managed to establish a foothold on the island. After the initial battle, the Britons, having recognized the strength of the Roman legions, sent men to negotiate peace. They offered their apologies for attacking the Romans on the beach and promised to hand over hostages. Seizing the opportunity to avoid further conflict and consolidate his position, Caesar accepted the offer. He took the decision to head inland with his legions and started building a fortified camp that would serve as his main operation base. The situation was complicated, however, when a rising tide, combined with a storm, severely damaged many of Caesar's ships. With no provisions or cavalry to easily forage, the Romans were forced to entrench themselves and send infantrymen to look for supplies, while a large portion of the remaining legionnaires had to repair the damaged ships with whatever they could find from the wreckage. After the ships had been repaired, and with winter approaching, Caesar decided to withdraw his forces from Britannia. Prior to his withdrawal, the Britons formed a tribal coalition to oust the Romans from the island. Caesar deployed his infantry in front of the camp and waited the attack. The Roman infantry held their ground against the Britons' chariots and cavalry. They were incapable of sustaining their attack, who were not used to fighting heavy infantry. The Britons retreated, and the Romans pursued them, killing anyone on foot, including civilians, as well as torching the villages. Caesar's first invasion of Britannia was brought to an end with the Romans leaving at night. While the campaign failed to result in a large-scale operation, it served as a good public relations stunt for Caesar. He became the first Roman to set foot on the island and extend the boundaries of the known world even further. In 54 BC, Caesar returned to Britannia the following year, this time better equipped and with a deeper knowledge of the Britons' tactics and terrain. The second invasion was more successful, resulting in several Roman victories and the submission of various Breton tribes. Caesar used the earlier setbacks as learning opportunities. He thoroughly studied the blunders of the first invasion, analyzing everything from the preparation and crossing of the English Channel to the battle tactics and logistics of the campaign. Caesar assembled a much larger force for this invasion. He deployed 5 legions and around 2,000 horsemen, a significantly larger contingent than the first raid. He also built a fleet of more sturdy carrier ships, specifically designed for crossing the English Channel and landing on steep beaches. Caesar lost no time in pushing inland into Britannia after the successful landing. He knew he had to quickly establish a strong position on the island to avoid any significant resistance from the Britons. Caesar led his legions across Britannia, finding scant resistance, but often advancing unopposed. He combined his battle tactics and diplomacy to conquer and subdue the tribes one by one. He appointed kings friendly to Roman rule and promised protection and privileges in exchange for loyalty and tribute. This not only reinforced the Roman position in Britannia, but also sent a clear message to the other tribes about the power and determination of the Romans. Although Britannia did not become a Roman province until almost a century later, Caesar's campaigns led the foundation for the future Roman annexation of the island. But Caesar still had one challenge to face: Ambiorix and Vercingetorix, leaders of Gaul tribes who rebelled against Roman rule. In 54 BC, while Caesar was busy in Britannia, the situation in Gaul was not peaceful. The Gallic tribes, while nominally under Roman control, kept a strong cultural identity and a longing for independence. Tribal leaders had secret meetings, voicing their dissatisfaction with Roman rule and discussing plans to resist Romanization. The discontent was fueled by several issues, including the taxation imposed by the Romans, the exploitation of Gaul resources, and the perception that Rome was eroding Gaul culture and identity. The resentment prompted the formation of a conspiracy against Rome. Led by Ambiorix, chief of the Eburon tribe, the conspiracy sought to expel the Romans from Gaul and reinstate Gallic independence. The conspiracy was thoroughly planned and executed, profiting from Caesar's absence and the division of the Roman legions. The reason for this was that Julius Caesar made a strategic decision in the winter of 54 BC to divide his legions. He had 8 legions under his command, a total of around 40,000 men, and chose to partition them, dispatching each to winter camps in different parts of Gaul. Whilst this decision was sensible from a logistical perspective, it left the legions isolated and vulnerable to attack. 2 of these legions were placed under the command of Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta and Quintus Titurius Sabinus, 2 of Caesar's trusted legatees. Cotta and Sabinus were sent with their legions into the Belgian territory and established their winter camp near the turf of the Eburon tribe. Within a few days of the arrival of the Roman legions, the Gauls made a surprise attack. Led by Ambiorix, the Eburonese mounted an all-out invasion of the Roman camp. While the Romans managed to repel the initial attack, they were taken by surprise and suffered heavy casualties. After the assault, Ambiorix requested a meeting with Cotta and Sabinus. With a reputation for being friendly with the Romans, Ambiorix managed to convince the legatees to meet with him under the banner of a truce. But during the meeting, Ambiorix delivered a startling revelation. He told of the existence of a Gaul conspiracy against Rome, asserting that several tribes, dissatisfied with Roman rule, had banded together in an alliance to expel the Romans from Gaul. Ambiorix affirmed that, although he was bound by his honor to join the insurrection, he did not wish to harm the Romans, and that is why he promised Cotta and Sabinus safe passage through the territory of the Eburonese, allowing them to join another Roman legion. After Ambiorix's promise of safe passage, Sabinus and Cotta were in a difficult position. They had to decide whether to trust him and march to the aid of the nearest Roman legion, or to remain in their winter camp. After a heated debate, Sabinus, convinced by Ambiorix's words, convinced Cotta to move with his legions. The decision to march turned deadly. Ambiorix had laid a trap for the Romans. As the Roman legions crossed into the territory of the Eburones, they were cornered by Gaul warriors. The Romans were trapped in a valley and surrounded on all sides. The Gauls' numerical superiority and the Romans' tactical disadvantage left them in a desperate situation. The following battle was brutal. The Romans fought bravely, but were outnumbered by the Gauls. Knowing how desperate the situation was, Sabinus decided to surrender to Ambiorix. On the other hand, Cotta fought on until his death. The rout and death of Sabinus and Cotta was a turning point in Ambiorix's revolt. Another Roman legion, under the command of Quintus Tullius Cicero, was camped not far away. They were stunned when Ambiorix's army appeared and besieged their camp. Quintus and his men resisted bravely, but were outnumbered and surrounded. Despite the siege, he managed to send a message to Caesar, informing him of the situation. Upon receiving the message, Caesar gathered 2 legions and marched to Quintus's aid. Caesar's arrival changed the tide of the uprising. Despite being outnumbered, he succeeded in defeating Ambiorix's army in several battles. The defeat of Ambiorix was a significant blow to the Gaul resistance and heralded the end of the revolt. With the defeat of Ambiorix's army, Caesar managed to break the siege of Quintus's camp. Its liberation was a moment of great relief for Quintus and his men, who had bravely resisted the assault. The lifting of the siege was also a significant victory for Caesar, proving his strategic skill and leadership. Meanwhile, Ambiorix's mutiny had an impact on Caesar's prestige. While he had managed to suppress the revolt, its occurrence was a blow to his reputation, showing that Gaul was far from being pacified, and that Gallic opposition to Roman rule was stronger than he had predicted. The leaders of the revolt had varying fortunes, but none of them were imprisoned for display at Julius Caesar's triumph in Rome. One of the leaders of the revolt, along with Ambiorix, called Catuvolcus, was already old and unable to flee. He cursed Ambiorix for starting the revolt and chose to die by drinking poison. In turn, Ambiorix and his men managed to flee across the Rhine, and from then on disappeared from historical records. But this rebellion was only the beginning, and soon Caesar would have to face another great test, this time against the leader of the Arverni tribe, Vercingetorix. Once the Romans had conquered Transalpine Gaul, the region was incorporated into the Roman Republic. The formerly independent Gauls were now under Roman rule and authority. The power and authority of the Gaul leaders was curtailed, leading to a feeling of loss of autonomy and unrest amongst the tribes. While Ambiorix's revolt had some initial success, it was eventually beaten back by the forces led by Julius Caesar. For this reason, around the winter of 52 BC, a gathering of the main tribal leaders was held to deliver a response to Caesar's cruel actions in the region. They all agreed and took a solemn oath to fight for Gaul's independence. It was the first time that the Gaul tribes had come together in a united front against a common enemy. One of the tribal leaders attending this meeting was Vercingetorix, a young leader well known for his fortitude and strategic skill. After the meeting, he arose as the leader of the Gallic army and became the central figure in its resistance against Roman rule in the following years. He was a member of the Arverni tribe, one of the most powerful in all of Gaul, as well as part of the Gallic nobility, giving him great political influence. Vercingetorix was the son of a king who had been murdered by his own people for trying to unite the Gaul tribes under his control. Intent on accomplishing what his father had failed to do, Vercingetorix set about mobilizing his own tribe to his cause. He used his persuasiveness to deliver a powerful message to the Gauls, showing them that the Romans were not invincible, and pointing out to them the defeats they had suffered before and the possibility of defeating them once more. If the Gaul tribes failed to stand together, they would be conquered one by one. These echoed through the minds of the tribes, who all pledged their support to Vercingetorix. He went on to lead a large army, poised to take on Caesar. In early 52 BC, he began his rebellion by launching an attack on Senabum, present-day Orléans in France. His charge led to the looting of stored provisions and the massacre of Roman merchants and officials. Information about this rebellion quickly traveled, with envoys sent by Vercingetorix to all corners of the region. Nearly all the tribes of Central Gaul responded to Vercingetorix's call to revolt, apart from the Aedui, allies of the Roman, who opted to remain neutral. While he was sorting things out in Rome, Caesar sent reinforcements to Gaul when he heard about the revolt. Although he wanted a lull in the campaign to strengthen his forces and wait for better weather conditions, Vercingetorix laid siege to the city of Gorgobina, one of Caesar's allies. To hold his ground in Gaul, Caesar needed to defend the city, and relied on Germanic mercenaries due to the shortage of cavalry. On the way, he also raided Senabum to retaliate for the previous Roman massacre, and took the city. In an attempt to weaken Caesar's Roman legions, Vercingetorix adopted a strategic tactic inspired by the Britons. He retreated before the Roman forces, preventing a full-scale battle, while at the same time razing to the ground the land he passed through. This tactic was intended to deny the Romans access to key supplies and resources. To do this, he decided to split his army. He led one part of his troops and headed towards the lands of the Bituriges, while assigning an assistant to lead another division and head towards the territories of the Ruthenians. As Caesar moved towards the Bituriges' lands, the tribe adopted a strategy of destroying their own estates, villages, and cities. Nonetheless, they failed to destroy their capital of Aricum, a city of great beauty in Gaul. Therefore, the leaders of the tribe begged the war council to allow them to protect the city from the Romans instead of destroying it. Although Vercingetorix was skeptical about defending Avaricum, acknowledging the Romans' ability to take the city, he was persuaded to yield to the collective urge to defend the capital. During its siege by the Romans, the Gauls denied supplies to the Romans, making it difficult for them to supply the troops. As a result, with nowhere else to turn, Caesar needed a quick victory, or his legions would starve. Furthermore, the Gauls undermined the capital walls to break them down. But, even with these efforts, the Romans managed to take the city by building a trench to the walls during a thunderstorm and attacking by surprise. Only a small fraction of the population escaped and sought refuge with their leader, Vercingetorix. Caesar wrote in his memoirs that, after the capture of Avaricum, only around 800 of the 40,000 inhabitants managed to safely reach Vercingetorix's camp. But this loss was not enough to put an end to the Gauls' morale. The day after the fall of Avaricum, Vercingetorix delivered a speech to downplay the impact on his own men's morale. He stated that he had not agreed to defend the city, asserting that he was swayed by the Bituriges, but pledged that he would secure more reinforcements and broaden his alliance with other Gaul tribes. The speech was warmly received, reinforced Vercingetorix's position, and further unified the rebels. Caesar remained in Avaricum for a few days, using the grain supplies from the captured city. His army needed rest and a chance to recoup after the heavy stresses of the siege. With the winter coming to an end, Caesar intended to set out in search of the enemy, either to bring them into battle or to surround and weaken them by starvation. However, before he left, leaders of the Aedui tribe arrived with a request for Caesar's help in resolving a tribal dispute. While the request may have led to an unwelcome delay in the campaign against Vercingetorix, Caesar could not ignore it. The Aedui were longtime allies of Rome and had provided valuable military support in the past, as well as being an important supplier. Once he had settled the Aedui's internal dispute, Caesar finally turned his attentions to his enemy. He left part of his army to help guard the grain supply and marched with 6 more legions towards the Arverni capital, Gergovia. Having taken the capital, Avaricum, Julius Caesar moved towards Gergovia, the Arverni capital. But Vercingetorix's cavalry was faster than Caesar's infantry, and when he reached Gergovia, the Gallic leader had enough time to devise a plan to defend the city. Knowing Caesar's mobility limitations, he used the strategic advantage provided by the cavalry and the city walls to draw up a resistance strategy. Caesar's march was grueling, spending 5 days of strenuous effort and culminating in a cavalry skirmish. Upon examining the location, however, Caesar realized that he would face overwhelming problems. Gergovia was strategically situated on top of a mountain, towering 1,200 feet, or 367 meters, above the plain. The terrain presented a series of insurmountable obstacles for Caesar. The steep cliffs on the north side of the mountain rendered a direct attack hopeless. The east side was equally difficult, with rugged, steep terrain riddled with gorges. Caesar faced a dilemma. There was no chance of taking Gergovia by direct attack. The only option left was to sever the city's food supply through a siege. But Caesar knew he would not be in a position to start this process until his own grain supplies were secure. The Roman general therefore found himself in a delicate predicament. Before imposing a siege on Gergovia, he had to ensure that his own troops were adequately supplied. Without a steady food supply, the siege's effectiveness would be compromised and his legions would be at great peril. Vercingetorix displayed outstanding skill in his strategic command of the hills around Gergovia. Strategically positioned, he took over a hill close to the city, dispersing the tribes living along the ridge. By keeping in constant communication with the tribal chiefs, he tried to ensure their loyalty and maintain the army's cohesion. However, with a daring plan, Caesar succeeded in launching a surprise attack during the night, driving out the Gallic garrison and taking control of the hill strategically placed in front of the city. To fortify his foothold even further, Caesar established a secondary camp on the hill, where he positioned 2 legions. Despite this early success, Caesar was at that point facing a conspiracy by the leader of the Aedui tribe, which was closely allied to the Romans. This leader held talks with the young members of the Aedui elite and started to plan his strategy. One of these leaders was Latavicus, who was appointed by Caesar as commander of 10,000 Aedui soldiers sent to help the Roman troops with their supply lines. He persuaded his men to abandon Caesar and join Vercingetorix. While marching towards Gergovia, Latavicus gave a rousing speech to his soldiers. He claimed that the Romans had slaughtered the Aedui noblemen and that they planned to do the same to the rest of the tribe. These misleading words were enough to convince the soldiers to betray Caesar and join Vercingetorix's ranks. Although Lataviccus's army was considerably smaller compared to Caesar's powerful legions, Lataviccus's betrayal posed a challenge to the Roman leader. The Aedui raided the Romans, who were guarding the supplies, jeopardizing the siege of Gergovia. To quell the Aedui revolt, Caesar split his forces, leaving 2 legions to defend Gergovia and heading the other 4 against the traitors. While he managed to quickly subdue the Aedui, this revolt left Caesar concerned about the possibility of facing additional revolts and being surrounded by the rebels. The situation soon worsened for the Romans. Caesar ordered a retreat before the rest of the Gaul forces, together with the one under Vercingetorix, surrounded them. The Romans were met with a fierce counterattack, with volleys fired from the city walls as they fought desperately around the foundations of the walls. Caesar's stance became increasingly desperate, with the initial Gallic force and the city walls in front of him. The Roman officers fought to keep discipline and form a defensive position, but the situation proved almost impossible. In this battle, Caesar reported the loss of 46 centurions, representing a quarter of all the centurions present, as well as 700 soldiers. After the catastrophic defeat at Gergovia, Julius Caesar was undeterred. The next day, he gathered his troops, and, while he scolded their lack of discipline, he also expressed admiration for the courage they had shown when faced with adversity. Caesar stressed that the loss was not due to the Gauls' superiority and bravery, but rather to fighting on rough terrain. Resolved to surmount the obstacles imposed by the terrain, Caesar led his legions to a strategic position on flat ground. Rather than offer a direct battle, Vercingetorix decided to retreat to the city of Gergovia. The twist frustrated Caesar and forced him to retreat, crossing the Loire River into the base established by Labienus, which would later become the city of Paris. Stripped of his supply base, Caesar had to find ways to offset his cavalry weakness. He recruited more Germanic mercenaries to bolster his ranks and cover the breach left by the Aedui. The fight for Gergovia was a significant setback for Caesar. This was the first time he had lost a field battle in Gaul, and it showed Vercingetorix's ability to use the Romans' own tactics and strategies against him. The defeat also occurred at a difficult time for Caesar, as his political power in Rome was starting to fragment with Crassus's death. When the Aedui joined the uprising led by Vercingetorix, there were differences over the commanding office. While Vercingetorix was renowned for his leadership and successful strategy in Gergovia, the Aedui tried to claim command for themselves. This quarrel led to the summoning of an assembly in Bicrocte, attended by several Gaul tribes. The assembly affirmed Vercingetorix as supreme commander, benefiting from the success achieved in Gergovia. This decision generated resentment among the Aedui, but they were very much involved in the uprising and could not abandon the coalition. Vercingetorix turned his attention to Caesar's supply convoy, hoping that his cavalry would be enough to prevent them from feeding themselves, even if he could not defeat the Roman legions. He launched his cavalry at the convoy, while his infantry drove the Roman vanguard apart. If the Romans lost their supplies, the campaign would be endangered. But it was clear that Vercingetorix was at a disadvantage in every aspect of the war. The Roman legions were vastly superior in numbers, and their Germanic cavalry proved unbeatable. Following an unsuccessful attack, Vercingetorix had to retreat to the Alesia fortress in preparation for a siege by Caesar. Even after his victory at the Battle of Gergovia, Vercingetorix was facing significant drawbacks that threatened his insurgency in many ways. Despite Caesar's remarks to the contrary, the Gauls were unlikely ever to have had a great numerical superiority over the Romans. Their infantry forces were far outnumbered by those of the Roman legions. On top of that, the Gaul cavalry had already proved unfit to take on the Germanic horsemen. After a failed initial attack, the Germanics succeeded in gaining high ground and launched a counterattack that tired the Gauls into retreat. When faced with this scenario, Vercingetorix felt the need to fall back and chose to take refuge in the fortress city of Alesia. But the march of Vercingetorix towards it took its toll in terms of casualties. Caesar promptly ordered his legion's baggage to be transferred to the nearest high ground. He appointed 2 of his legions to protect it, while the rest of the army set off in pursuit of Vercingetorix. This continued until dark, and, according to Caesar, the Gauls suffered an additional 3,000 casualties before finally reaching the safety of Alesia. Alesia was the capital of the Mandubi and stood on a limestone plateau with an elevation of approximately 1,300 feet, or about 400 meters above sea level, covering an impressive area. Knowing that Caesar would follow him, Vercingetorix started to prepare for a siege. By then, he had grasped the critical importance of supplies, so he dismissed his cavalry, who would be of no help in a siege, and ordered them to summon support from all over Gaul. But soon after the cavalry left, the Romans reached Alesia. Since a straightforward attack was precluded, the only viable alternative for Caesar was to capture Alesia by means of a siege, which required the construction of fortifications. Over the following days, the Romans dedicated themselves to building a ditch around Alesia, with the aim of cutting it off completely. After this, they set up about building an outward-facing wall, stretching over 16 kilometers, designed to contain the Gallic army. To protect against surprise attacks, 23 forts were built along the perimeter of the siege wall, as garrison points. Inside the Alesia walls, the Gauls prepared themselves with hooks, spears, and siege ladders, which they would use to attack the Roman lines as soon as help arrived from outside Alesia. And that help finally showed up, with Caesar reporting a figure of 250,000 Gauls. While Caesar probably overestimated the number, we can safely say that this was the largest army ever assembled by the Gauls. The tribes engaged in this conflict included practically all of Caesar's conquests since 58 BC, pointing to the impressive scale of the rebellion. The Gauls' strategy was to attack the Romans on 2 concurrent fronts. While Vercingetorix was leading an attack on the enemy's inner lines, the commanders who had just landed would coordinate attacks on the Romans from outside the walls. Caesar found himself entirely surrounded by the Gaul forces, but there was a critical stalemate. Vercingetorix's resources and supplies were quickly running out, making the situation even more desperate. Confronted with this extreme depletion, Vercingetorix was pushed to make an agonizing decision. He handed over all the non-combatants in the city, including famished women and children. This innocent mob headed towards the Roman lines in search of help, even offering themselves up as slaves, but the Romans did not allow them to get through. Meanwhile, the Gauls surrounding the city also refused to take these people back. The result was a senseless tragedy, in which these innocents were left marooned between the fighting lines, meeting a terrible end due to a lack of food, water, and shelter. Moreover, the Gauls were powerless to effectively coordinate the attacks of those inside the walls with the outside troops. At last, Caesar led a decisive charge at just the right moment, pushing back the Gauls. Caesar's superior auxiliary cavalry played a key role in defeating Vercingetorix. The Germanic cavalry used the opportunity to surround and attack the Gaul warriors as they retreated. Discouraged and short of supplies, the Gaul backdrop began to disperse, leaving Vercingetorix isolated in Alesia, with no realistic hope of rescue. The Roman legions were too depleted to launch an immediate pursuit of the retreating Gauls. Yet, at midnight, Caesar commanded his cavalry to be sent in pursuit of the withdrawing Gauls. The Roman horsemen succeeded in reaching the rear of the Gauls and dealt additional casualties during the chase, further increasing the pressure on Vercingetorix's army. The situation inside Alesia was despairing, and the only prospect left was to face a lingering agony caused by starvation. The day after the battle, Vercingetorix held a meeting with tribal leaders and made the decision to offer his own surrender to Caesar. Vercingetorix sent couriers to the Romans seeking terms of agreement, but the response he received was unyielding. Only a complete surrender would be accepted. Plutarch told how Vercingetorix made a dramatic escape from the city. Wearing his best armor, he rode through the gates and bypassed Caesar, who was sitting in a courtroom. In a symbolic gesture of surrender, he dismounted from his horse and threw his armor on the ground. He then sat down at Caesar's feet, lying motionless until he was handed over to the Roman soldiers, who would hold him captive until Caesar's triumph. The other Gaul warriors were delivered as slaves to the Roman legionnaires, with the exception of the Aedui, who whom Caesar allowed to return to their homes, in keeping with his previous alliance with the tribe. In turn, Vercingetorix was put in chains and sent to Rome, where he was kept prisoner for the next 6 years. In 46 BC, Caesar was finally ready to celebrate his triumph, and Vercingetorix was brought in chains before Caesar's chariot, serving as living proof of Gaul's defeat. It was the traditional way for a captured enemy leader to be paraded during a Roman triumph. After this event, Vercingetorix was finally executed. This tragic turn of events sealed the end of Gallic resistance. The Gauls, however, never forgot the time they were united as a nation under Vercingetorix's leadership. Once Vercingetorix had been crushed, Caesar and his Roman legions launched campaigns against the Gauls to eliminate any chance of rebellion, allowing the Romans to achieve the much-desired regional peace. Ultimately, over a period of 8 years, Julius Caesar seized not only the whole of Gaul, but also parts of Britannia. This achievement not only solidified his military dominance, but also made him extremely wealthy, owing to the resources and loot obtained during the Gallic Wars. He also achieved a legendary reputation as a strategist and military leader. The Gallic Wars helped Caesar's rise to prominence on the Roman political scene, granting him the legitimacy to later unleash a civil war against Pompey and the Roman Senate. If you enjoyed learning more about Caesar's conquest of Gaul, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Until the next video.